No is my answer. Obviously, you wouldn't put a question in the title if the answer is going to be yes. You just say the statement. This will be a bit of a messy one. I want to rush out this video, which means compared to normal, it'll be overlong and more ill-judged. What I'd like to do here is not really a review of the game. I'm going to take the top bit of discourse around the game and deconstruct that so exhaustively that no one will ever want to engage in it ever again. But it is a very good game. Definitely one of the games of the year. But sort of like what happened with Barbie, this came out and people were going, this is a win for audiences. This is what the people hunger for. What, you mean big budget IP sequels? But I think the reason why people are saying that is because most posts online are designed specifically to annoy me. But it went further than that. There has been frothing gamer rage around this game. Not about the game, because the game is quite good, but people are mad at non-Baldur's Gate 3 developers for not making Baldur's Gate 3. To quote a YouTuber who's like 1 million times more popular than me, finally, a CRPG with none of the microtransaction bullshit. Now, I don't know if you've ever played a CRPG before. They're sort of niche, mechanically obtuse, narrative-focused single-player experiences. They've not typically been the form for that sort of monetization model. It's a supposedly pro-consumer, anti-developer rage. I'm not exactly sure how developers are responsible for pricing strategy, but I suppose it is pro-consumer, because if there's one thing gamers hate more than games, it's the people who make them. But not only that, any pushback against this discussion has been dismissed as being anti-consumer. So I don't want to position myself as being anti-consumer, but I do think anyone who has ever consumed before should be killed now. I'll do a bit of an overview of the game to establish some common ground. Sort of like a review, but I'm going to call it something different so that there's less expectation around it. The premise is, you and a bunch of people got aliened, like the movie Alien, but in the eye instead. And you've got to find a way to remove that before you turn into a monster. Sort of the cyberpunk premise, but instead of Keanu Reeves, the threat is that you'll turn into a squid. And then you crash land in a generic wilderness area where there's a bunch of goodies and a bunch of baddies, and you have to resolve their differences by doing a mass murder and also figure out how to get this squid out of your eye, which is a nice gameplay setup and premise. And the narrative from there is functional, it's fine, it's just sort of stock fantasy stuff. I think it does a good job, actually, of being like D&D. Maybe feels a little bit theatre nerd about it. Not really for me, but generally competently written, and does a lot of sort of servicing the player. Not fan service necessarily, but stroking the player off. And the gameplay itself is great. It feels very immersive sim. You can call anything an immersive sim. You know, there's multiple ways to unlock doors. You can go around pushing people off cliffs and laying down traps and dipping your arrow in fire before shooting it, or creating surfaces for people to slip on. And that's really where this game is at its peak, where it really feels a lot like tabletop. You can sort of scrabble around and do wacky bullshit to get through the combat. So that's sort of how the game starts out, that's how it plays, that's the stuff that everyone's been talking about. But some people have got a little bit crazy with it from there. So there's a little wave of stupid clickbait sort of stuff that Baldur's Gate 3 was threateningly polished at launch. It was so perfect of a game when it came out immediately that developers hate it. Doctors hate Baldur's Gate 3. You won't last 5 minutes. Now, it's a stupid discussion for a lot of reasons, but I wanted to single out a couple big ones here. Firstly, it's been in early access. It has been selling at full price for 3 years. They've had a lot of time to polish it. And I think that early access iteration really shows. You can see all that reactivity, that micro reactivity in Act 1 of the game. The combat encounters are designed to be approached in so many different ways. The dialogue brings up all little tidbits of pieces that you personally have done that other people wouldn't do. All these little choices, and it just stacks up to really give the player a feeling of agency in this story. I think it's an incredible feat, and part of how they've been able to achieve that is through all of this early access iteration. They have been able to work around what players are doing and factor in those choices and actually build them into the game. And that's really the feeling of Act 1. It really rewards the player through everything. You can do stuff that feels like it should have negative consequences, or even does have negative consequences, like story-wise, but the gameplay only ever rewards you, the player. It feels like that wasn't their initial intention, but through all of this feedback, that's where they've ended up. And I think it is interesting and it's good entertainment, but yeah, maybe their intention has been warped a bit. Like, one of the things that sold me on giving the game a go was this idea that all of the companions hated each other and hated you, and there was a lot of antagonism to deal with. That is not true at all. They maybe all start off with some bite, but if you pick 2 dialogue options that they agree with, then they start begging you for sex. They turn into puppy dogs who want to suck you off. But it feels like that's again about rewarding the player and building this story around the early access player, making something that's maximally rewarding. Everyone wants to suck you off. I would probably find it a little more rewarding if they were more reticent, but they've built a game where you can beat all odds. You are awesome all the time. You can only ever be rewarded for your actions. But I think it's sort of counter to what the game is and what the game is trying to be. And I dug in a bit, and it's sort of counter to how the game started out. The pitch is like this dark fantasy world that's all about survival, sacrifice, and betrayal. And that's not what it's ended up being at all. It's a very light fantasy about stroking the player, which is fine, and that's an angle to go for. That's just a different intention, nothing wrong with that. And I think in that Act 1 early access part of the game, it really nails doing that. It's just a awesome, lovely, whimsical D&D adaptation, which is cool. So yeah, whatever. The point is, this isn't really threateningly polished on day one, because this isn't really day one. They've had all of this time to rebuild their game around the player and make it maximally rewarding and polished and all that stuff. Now, I promised a second reason why this threateningly polished at launch stuff was stupid, and that is, it's not that polished. It's a broken, unfinished game. I had a few game-breaking bugs, like my save files wouldn't work anymore, though they did patch that, and plenty of like sequencing and dialogue ones where things were flagged incorrectly. NPCs would come back to life doing stuff in a wrong order, fuck something up, or characters will talk about things that will never happen in your game, presumably like cut content. Your companions are going, oh, we need to go get this item. You mean the one you're holding in your hand? That one? I can't believe you did that. What, you mean the thing that I didn't do? There's just plenty of day one jank. Which is fine, and I think I have faith that they will fix that stuff with patches. They've already done some pretty big patches to it. In the first half of the game, you can fuck a lot of stuff up. You can do things in weird orders. You can cheese all of the combat encounters, and the game allows that to happen. The further you go, the more the emergent gameplay dries up, and the more the reactivity goes wrong. It really starts to feel rushed, aimless, and undercooked. As you reach the end of Act 2, the possibilities start to close in on you. You start to find that there are things you can't do. There are things that aren't factored in. You start to experience, oh, I'm not supposed to be here yet. I'm not supposed to do that. And for me, that's coupled with the combat encounter design getting more restrictive. Gone is the creative positioning and hazards and verticality of the start of the game that made that feel really emergent. It's more like increasing enemy numbers, increasing boss health, and the addition of friendly NPCs who you're not supposed to let die. And some bosses get the introduction of insta-kill mechanics, which does increase the scale of the fight, but I don't think it makes it more exciting. It means you're waiting for dice rolls, waiting for characters to take their turn, and hoping that the friendly non-player characters don't just run to their deaths, which they always do. So the game started and it taught you that it was all about rewarding the player. You could never truly fail. There were always ways out. You could always keep moving forward. In the dialogue as well. No matter how much you failed, there was always a way to keep going. But then in the back half of the game, save scumming becomes a necessity. I guess all I'm saying is the combat at this point becomes like a normal CRPG, which to me, as a big CRPG fan, is incredibly disappointing. CRPG combat sucks. And more generally, just the pace of it gets fucked. It feels like their scope was a little bit too broad. for what they could achieve, and probably too broad to be sensible. For whatever reason, they have aimed for like a whole entire separate game to take place in Act 3. If you're familiar with narrative structure, Act 3, that's the climax, that's the punchy, exciting bit where everything gets paid off. Act 3 here is where all of the stakes of the game get reset, we introduce some new villains, and they try to fit in a whole entire game's worth of content. Every companion gets at least one boss fight. It's this massive pile of content with no clear thrust, and not a lot of polish either. The first 2 acts do feel narratively cohesive. They're telling one story. It makes some pretty big leaps and stretches to tack Act 3 onto that. There is an optional player character that you can choose that directly ties into a lot of the plot threads in Act 3. If you don't choose them, they're just missing from the story. If you do choose them, you have a reason to be there. And I believe the original intention for the generic player character was to give you the backstory of this character that they've separated out as an option. So I think it's again just reworking the game to be a bit more player friendly, but for me it just meant I was missing story here. And it starts to get really extreme in how prescriptive it is, in the order that you do things and the way that you do things. There's a point where one of your companions gets taken hostage, which is immediately like, whoa, there's negative consequence? Where did this come from? And then, if you try and chase down that plot thread, get your companion back, follow the clues to figure out what's going on, you can't do that either. You're not supposed to do that in that order. There is a correct order and way to do things in Act 3, and if you don't do it that way, you get locked out, narrative threads get cut off, things get fucked up massively. It didn't make me hate the game, and I'm not trying to be hysterical about it, but I think genuinely every single quest in Act 3 in some way went wrong for me. Sort of Act 1, you can try anything and it works. And then Act 3, it's like, please stop trying anything, it won't work. Reload your save and do things the way you're supposed to. And then the ending itself is largely currently missing from the game. They accidentally over-exaggerated how many endings they have by 16,998. I think I did a pretty normal goody two-shoes run through the game, and it has to make some insane narrative leaps to justify that ending. If you do the ending that I took right before the final fight of the game, 2 characters have to go against the characterization that built up through the entire game, reverse that, and then do things that just should not be physically possible for them to do. It's a very sort of, we've only scripted one ending here, sort of narrative reach. But it has this insane downer ending. It's a game that non-stop sucks you off until the ending stretch here. You can work for the best possible endings for all your companions, which I did. It doesn't matter, there isn't, but it just feels like unfinished cut content they couldn't get done in time, especially with all your companions triggering the wrong dialogue and stuff. It feels like just the logic to get the endings to work wasn't working, so they had to shelve it for now. My ending went, I kill the bad guy, we get a miscellaneous vignette of the people of Baldur's Gate doing stuff, I die, one of my companions dies, cut to credits. I quite liked the insane downer ending itself, because I'm a sick and twisted psycho, but it doesn't feel like that was how it was supposed to go. Not in terms of intent. I've seen people theorizing that there were better endings planned. I'm not sure about that, but it is an insane whiplash to come off of this game, which is all about constantly cheating out a positive outcome no matter what, until the very end where they ran out of development time to do that. Once it starts pivoting into forced choice and consequence, it starts to feel insane. Maybe that ending is closer to what the game was intended to be, but it's not what the game has become. It feels to me like a compromised vision. There's sort of 2 different games here, with 2 different goals existing in the same space, and the collision of those 2 things feels like a mistake. The story that the game was telling could have ended at the end of Act 2, but then they wanted to do all of this epic Baldur's Gate stuff. Their scope was too big, and it fell apart a bit. But I think a lot can and will be fixed here. Straight up bug fixes, adding back the epilogues, maybe some tuning and tweaking to those combat encounters would help the pace of that last act, and maybe even some cut content. But the problem really isn't a lack of content. If anything, the scope is too big. But I'm not trying to say I hate it. It's not excessively broken. And I think if you're buying a game at launch, you know what you're in for. But it is funny to hold up as an example of perfection. You know, this idea that Baldur's Gate 3 is not like other games. It is. It's like other games. Baldur's Gate 3 is part of the exact same system, subject to the exact same incentives and market forces. And my point isn't that this game should be hated. I don't think singling out any one game for having problems on launch is really worthwhile at this point. It is a broader problem than that. I mean, I think partly this is just a big, immersive, emergent, reactive game, and there's a lot of factoring in real-world scenarios that they don't know about until it's out there in the world. No one wants to release a broken, unfinished game, especially like individual developers and creatives working on these things. But even the producers, publishers, studios, money people don't really want to be releasing an unfinished game, though they will cut their losses at a certain point. There's an incentive to rush out bigger, more complex products, targeting bigger audiences with fancier graphics, pushing the budget and scope to the limit and trying to release it to dominate as much cultural space as possible. This is a massive, big budget game that I think went 2 years over schedule. At some point, they do just have to recoup their costs. And that's the thing with these AAA games, is they are always compromised by the incentives of money. And I think that was the point being made by the one tweet that sparked this anti-developer controversy. Specifically, they were praising smaller games, I think. And basically, the people getting mad at this one tweet and the tweet itself are making the same point. Probably worth noting that no one was making a case for broken games with predatory business models. The hordes of developers mad at Baldur's Gate 3 do not exist. I mean, someone down there is going to be like, no, I saw a tweet from a AAA developer. Wow, you saw a tweet? That's fucking awesome. Should we do a news cycle about it? But it's those same incentives at play with the reviewers and influencers talking about the game. Is it? Yes. Is it? Yes. Is it? It's a tenuous segue, get over it. Reviewers and influencers are incentivized to rush takes out fast, to dominate that cultural space. In online content creation, you have to have the most extreme take out now. Is it the best thing ever? Is it the worst thing ever? Who am I supposed to attack about this? Don't do a belated, nuanced deconstruction 4 weeks later. I think review codes for this only went out 3 days before it came out. So probably a big reason why people haven't mentioned this stuff is because it takes you like 50 hours to get to the point where the game starts to fall apart. Game reviews and discussion about games is, I think, in a weird position where it's often somewhere between art criticism and consumer advice. It probably is good consumer advice to say that Baldur's Gate 3 is a perfect game. Because look, you're going to get like 50 hours of great entertainment out of it. Is it finished? No, but it is appropriately valued product. And what sort of sick freak is actually going to get to the end of the game anyway? To me, this feels like a less complete game than Cyberpunk 2077. Now, I realize that's the most insane, inflammatory thing I could possibly say, but I mean it 100% sincerely, and not as an insult. It's just the critical path and character stories of that game felt cohesive from intent to execution, beginning to end, and to me, that matters. But I can see that Cyberpunk was more immediately disappointing than Baldur's Gate 3, especially given it was sort of over-marketed. And the gamer is someone who falls in love with promotional material and hates video games, is always let down by the reality of video games. Already, people are gearing up to be pissed off about Starfield. The broken game backlash feels more to do with expectation. A game lets you down in contrast to expectation, or it's alienating rather than entertaining, or you just don't want to play it and it's been marketed hugely. And the gamer starts to look for objective problems with it. If it crashes, if it's missing features, that's fantastic. And the goal of the influencer is to replicate and amplify those snappy criticisms and negative emotions. You can do really well for yourself if you just find a rage bait circle jerk to replicate. And I think that's where all this stuff really comes from. This discussion around Baldur's Gate 3 is based on nothing. None of it holds up, but it is a good way to get the clicks. I think there's a lot of very good game in here. So good I feel like playing more of it, but I don't really relish the idea of going through that Act 3 again. I think at some point I will. I believe that they can only really improve it from here. So at some point in the future, I will go through this game again, and I'll have a great time doing it. Feels like it's probably not exactly aimed at me. It feels like it's a little bit of an awkward mix of two things that don't belong together. It just needs a little bit more time, which is fine. I think it is a special game. It's really cool that it's come out. It's really cool that it's successful. But I think there's been a lot of cool stuff happening in the CRPG space, and I worry that the success of this would encourage bigger and more complex as the end goal, where I think this game actually would have benefited from a reduction in scope sooner. So, has Baldur's Gate 3 set a new standard? No, I don't think so. It's good, but it seems exactly indicative of where we're at. So there we go. Hopefully that's alright with you. The takeaway is nothing. I don't want to see mention of any of this stuff ever again. Check out the website for weekly videos if you want to support me. I did a review of Baldur's Gate 3 before I was done playing it. I was incentivized by money to rush out a review before it was ready. Though I did flag up my issues with it because I know what I'm doing. But anyway, that's enough.